Imagine trying to stop a screeching audio feedback loop in a crowded auditorium, right?
Oh, man. That is like the most anxiety-inducing sound in the world.
It really is.
Mhm.
But, okay, imagine you're only allowed to fix the microphone,
Yeah.
and you're completely forbidden from touching the speakers.
Right. So the harder you try to adjust that mic, the louder and more painful the screech gets?
Exactly. And that kind of impossible physics is, um, it's basically what we ask educators to navigate every single day when they're dealing with severe behavioral issues in the classroom.
Yeah, that's a really good analogy, actually.
We focus all our energy on treating the student, which is the microphone in this scenario, and we completely ignore the adult at the front of the room, the speaker who's just actively burning out from the noise.
Yeah, totally.
So welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. We are so glad you could join us. We're exploring a really fascinating stack of materials today, detailing the operations of MentalSpace School, which is this K-12 mental health support system currently operating in Georgia.
And it's a super interesting model.
It really is. And what's so compelling for you as the listener to take away from this framework is that it treats student behavioral needs and educator burnout not as, two separate issues. It treats them as one single, highly reactive, interconnected ecosystem.
Which is, frankly, a profound shift in how we understand the whole architecture of a classroom.
Right.
Because historically, schools have placed student interventions in one bucket, like usually labeled special education or counseling or whatever.
It's a student bias.
Exactly. And then staff wellness goes in a completely different bucket managed by like human resources.
Totally isolated from each other.
Completely. But to understand why this specific school-wide solution for MentalSpace is structured the way it is, we really first need to look closely at the exact clinical challenge we're dealing with here.
Right, because the context is everything.
Yeah, you really cannot fully appreciate why this ecosystem approach is necessary without thoroughly examining the condition that disrupts it in the first place.
Okay, let's get right into that, because the condition at the center of this research is Oppositional Defiant Disorder, or ODD.
Yes, ODD.
And I want to start here because this feels like one of those terms that has been entirely co-opted by casual conversation, right?
100%.
We hear people say, like, oh, that kid is just being defiant, or they immediately blame the behavior on the parents. Society just slaps a label of, bad kid or lazy parenting on the situation and just moves on.
Yeah, everyone's an armchair psychologist.
Exactly. But looking at the clinical definitions provided in our sources, ODD is a very strict, formal medical diagnosis. It is absolutely not a case of a kid just, like, being a bit difficult on a Tuesday morning.
Exactly. What is absolutely vital here is separating that societal judgment from the clinical reality. An ODD diagnosis is always, like, without exception, made by a licensed clinician.
All right, to medical.
Yeah. This isn't a teacher's informal label written on a sticky note in the staff room or a principal's, disciplinary category. It is defined by a very specific, persistent pattern of behavior.
And the sources break that down into three main pillars, right?
They do. So those pillars are an irritable or angry mood, argumentative and defiant behavior, and perhaps most uniquely here, vindictiveness.
Okay, wait, let's pause on that last word.
Yeah.
Vindictiveness.
Yeah.
Because that is a remarkably heavy concept, especially when we're talking about children and adolescents. I mean, it implies something much darker and more intentional than simply refusing to do a math worksheet.
It does. It implies a real level of deliberate retaliation. So in a classroom setting, this isn't just a student saying no when asked to sit down.
Right. There's just normal defiance.
Right. Vindictiveness might look like a student waiting until the teacher turns around and then purposefully destroying another student's science project, specifically because the teacher praised that project earlier.
Oh, wow. So it's very targeted.
Very targeted. There is a calculated desire to inflict frustration or harm in response to a perceived slight. But, and this is the critical piece of this diagnostic puzzle, the thing that separates ODD from standard, everyday childhood rebellion is the timeline and the developmental context.
Right, because, every toddler throws tantrums.
Right.
And every teenager pushes boundaries. That's just the baseline of human development.
Precisely. A child asserting independence is totally normal.
Yeah.
ODD is when that behavior is intensely magnified, entirely disproportionate to the situation, and crucially, stubbornly persistent.
Persistent for how long?
Well, to meet the clinical criteria, this pattern of mood, defiance, and vindictiveness must last for at least 6 months.
6 months.
Yes.
Wow, when you map that onto the school calendar, the implications of that are just staggering.
Really puts it in perspective.
It really does. Because a standard school year is what, roughly 9 or 10 months long?
Yeah, about that.
So if a clinician requires a 6-month pattern to even consider a diagnosis, that means a teacher is managing this intense, escalating behavior for the vast majority of the time they have that student in their room.
Exactly.
We aren't talking about a kid having like a rough 2-week transition back from summer break or acting out because their parents are going through a brief, stressful patch. This is a deeply entrenched systemic behavioral pattern.
And that duration is exactly why the ripple effect is so devastating to the classroom environment.
Yeah.
It's not an isolated incident that you can resolve with a quick trip to the principal's office,
Yeah.
It is a daily, relentless dynamic.
Right.
Which brings us to the physiological toll this takes on the adults in the room. And the data points clearly to the fact that it is not just the lead teachers who are impacted.
Oh, absolutely not.
Yeah.
The sources highlight paraprofessionals, school counselors, school nurses. They all carry a remarkably heavy emotional weight when they are tasked with supporting these students.
Yeah, the whole ecosystem of staff.
So let's dig into that physiological toll, because we throw the word burnout around a lot, almost as a synonym for just like being tired.
Right, like, oh, I'm so burned out today.
Exactly. But in the context of these classrooms, burnout seems to be an acute occupational hazard. What is actually happening biologically to an educator who spends 6 months absorbing vindictive or highly defiant behavior?
To really understand the burnout, you have to look at the neurology of the interaction.
Okay, lay it on me.
So when an adult is confronted with aggressive, defiant, or vindictive behavior, their brain naturally perceives a threat. The amygdala, which is the brain's alarm system, fires off, flooding the body with cortisol and adrenaline.
It's just a biological fight or flight response?
Literally, yes. However, to effectively support a student with ODD, the adult cannot fight and they cannot flee. Best practices dictate that staff must be able to stay regulated and set what the clinical literature calls warm, firm limits.
Warm, firm limits. Okay, so what does that actually look like? You aren't yelling, obviously.
Right.
You aren't being hostile or matching the student's aggressive energy, but you are holding an absolute, immovable boundary.
Exactly. You are essentially saying, I care about you, you are safe here, but you absolutely cannot throw that chair.
Got it.
But maintaining that warm, firm posture requires the adult to actively override their own biological survival instincts. They have to use their prefrontal cortex to, forcefully suppress their amygdala.
Which sounds exhausting.
It requires an immense amount of emotional and physiological energy. If an educator is doing that 5, 10, or 20 times a day, their nervous system eventually just stays locked in a state of hyperarousal.
And here is where I want to play devil's advocate for a second.
Go for it.
Because the framework we are reviewing basically says that treating the child requires the staff to avoid burnout. It literally treats the teacher's emotional regulation as an active ingredient in the kid's medical treatment plan.
Yes, it does.
But, I mean, isn't it a massive overstep for a healthcare model to prescribe interventions for school employees just because a student is acting out? Doesn't that uncomfortably blur the line between a school's HR department and a student's pediatric healthcare?
Oh, it absolutely blurs the line, and that is honestly the intentional genius of the model.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we have to discard this notion that a classroom is just a neutral container where learning happens. It is a biological environment. You simply cannot successfully intervene with a dysregulated child if the adult's nervous system is completely fried.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right. If the teacher is burned out, their tone of voice changes, their micro-expressions become rigid, and their patience just evaporates. And the ODD student, who is already hypervigilant and prone to perceiving hostility, reads those subtle cues and escalates their behavior.
So the microphone screeches, the speaker blows out, and the feedback loop intensifies.
Precisely. The educator's wellness is no longer seen as just a nice perk offered by HR on a Friday. It is a clinical necessity for the student's therapeutic success.
Okay, that makes perfect sense when you lay it out like that. So how does MentalSpace School actually break that feedback loop in these Georgia districts? The materials outline a highly specific, synchronized approach. Like, it is not just putting a kid in a room with the school counselor for 15 minutes a week and hoping for the best.
Not at all. Because ODD is a complex clinical diagnosis, it requires heavy-duty, evidence-based interventions. The MentalSpace framework targets both sides of the loop simultaneously. Let's look at the student and family side first, right?
Okay.
The primary interventions here are individual cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT for the child, paired with parent-child interaction therapy, commonly known as PCIT, for the family.
Break down PCIT for me, because CBT is somewhat familiar to most people, right?
Yeah.
Helping the child understand their internal thought processes and physical triggers. But how does PCIT actually work mechanically? Because the sources made it sound like more than just giving a parent a pamphlet on discipline.
Oh, it is incredibly hands-on. So imagine a living room setting or a playroom. The parent and the child are playing together. The therapist is observing this interaction live, often through a one-way mirror in a clinic, or increasingly via a secure video feed. And the parent is actually wearing a discrete earpiece.
Wait, like an actual earpiece?
Like an actual earpiece. So when the child exhibits defiant behavior, the therapist speaks directly into the parent's ear, coaching them in real time on exactly what to say, what tone to use, and when to completely ignore a minor provocation to avoid escalating it.
Wow. So it is literal live-action coaching.
It is.
The therapist is essentially reprogramming the parent's immediate reactions so they don't fall into the traps the ODD behavior sets.
Exactly. It equips the family to handle the behavior at home, stabilizing the child's domestic environment.
Right.
But, and this is the key, fixing the home doesn't solve the fact that the child still spends up to 8 hours a day in a classroom with a teacher.
Right.
Which brings us to the second half of the intervention. Confidential staff, teletherapy.
And this is where the model closes the loop. They provide dedicated confidential therapy specifically for the educators who are teaching these high-need students, alongside just broader staff wellness support.
Right. And why does confidentiality matter so much here?
I would assume because teachers don't want to look bad.
Exactly. Historically, teachers are terrified to admit they are struggling with classroom management. There is deep-seated fear that asking for help will result in a poor performance review from administration.
Yeah, like, oh, you can't handle your class? We're noting that in your file.
Precisely. So by providing an external, confidential therapeutic outlet, the educator has a safe space to process the intense cortisol spikes and emotional exhaustion of the day. They can actually rebuild their capacity to maintain those warm, firm limits. You are stabilizing the three most critical points in that child's life: their internal mind through CBT, their home environment through PCIT, and their classroom environment by regulating the educator.
Which sounds undeniably brilliant in clinical theory. I mean, I don't think anyone listening to this would argue against supporting the whole ecosystem. But then theory inevitably collides with the real world, right?
It always does.
You hit school administration, budget constraints, insurance denials, endless red tape. A holistic approach is completely useless if it takes a year to get approved. But the data in these sources shows how this is actually being executed on the ground without getting completely bogged down.
Yeah, the logistics of this framework are arguably the most important part of our discussion today, because deployment is everything.
Absolutely.
The primary way they deploy this complex clinical care in a school setting seamlessly is through same-day teletherapy, utilizing dedicated therapist teams assigned to specific schools.
Wait, I have to stop you at same-day teletherapy.
I know.
Because anyone who has tried to navigate the mental health system recently knows that getting a same-day appointment is practically a myth. Usually you're sitting on a waiting list for 3 to 6 months just for an intake call.
Yeah, it's brutal. And in a school environment, a 3-month waiting list is a catastrophe. If a family is finally in enough crisis to ask a school for help, that is a fleeting window of opportunity.
Right.
If you tell a parent, great, we will see you in October, the crisis will escalate, the student might fail the grade, or the teacher might just quit the profession entirely. Same-day access captures the willingness to engage the exact moment it peaks.
That makes total sense.
And furthermore, these dedicated teams aren't just handling routine check-ins. They are composed of licensed, culturally competent therapists who are equipped for severe crisis intervention, including suicide and violence prevention.
But let's talk about the elephant in the room for so many families and school districts, which is the financial friction. How is this actually paid for?
Good question.
The framework notes that they accept almost all major commercial insurance plans, like Blue Cross, Cigna, Aetna. But the single most striking detail in this entire operational manual is the Medicaid policy.
Oh, yeah.
The out-of-pocket cost for Medicaid families is $0.
$0. We cannot overstate how that specific detail is the linchpin holding this entire operation together.
I believe it.
Financial friction is usually the very first place interventions die. A parent might really want help for their child, but if it means choosing between a copay and buying groceries, the therapy gets canceled.
Every time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a $0 Medicaid cost combined with that same-day access we talked about completely removes the traditional barriers that historically keep the most vulnerable families from receiving care. You are removing the financial friction and the scheduling friction simultaneously. That fundamentally changes the trajectory for a family in crisis.
It's huge. It also seems to radically shift the school district's ability to stay legally compliant. The documentation emphasizes that this entire operation is strictly HIPAA and FERPA compliant. So both the patient's medical privacy and the student's educational privacy are legally firewalled.
Right, which is vital for the schools.
But there's another piece of legislation mentioned here that really caught my eye. They specifically highlight support for the HB 268 compliance deadline coming up in July 2026. What exactly is HB 268 and why is an external therapy group tracking it so closely?
So HB 268 is a specific legislative mandate in Georgia that requires public school districts to formalize their mental health infrastructure and safety reporting protocols.
Right.
Essentially, the state is realizing that schools are the de facto mental health providers for millions of kids, and they are mandating that districts have robust, verifiable systems in place to handle crises.
Got it. So districts are essentially staring down the barrel of a state mandate and probably panicking about how to build a mental health clinic inside a middle school without violating medical privacy laws.
Precisely. It's a huge headache for them. By integrating an external system like MentalSpace School, district administrators aren't just putting out today's fires, they are future-proofing their schools. It proves this isn't just a rogue feel-good program. It is an actual institutional infrastructure built to satisfy impending state-level mandates while actually delivering clinical care.
Wow. So what does this all mean when you step back and look at the results? When you combine the clinical theory of the feedback loop, the two-pronged treatment for students and educators, and a logistical machine that eliminates financial barriers, what actually happens?
The outcomes are pretty incredible.
The success statistics are frankly staggering. The data reports an 89% improvement in student attendance, and we're seeing a 92% reduction in anxiety symptoms.
Those numbers validate the entire ecosystem hypothesis.
Yeah.
Traditional models that pull a student out of class for a chat while leaving the burned-out teacher and the overwhelmed parent entirely unsupported, they rarely yield an 89% improvement in attendance.
Because the student just walks right back into the same screeching feedback loop.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when you reduce a student's anxiety by 92% through CBT and PCIT, you aren't just helping that one student. You are actively extinguishing the daily behavioral fires that cause teacher burnout.
Yes.
And conversely, when you support the teacher through confidential teletherapy, allowing them to rebuild their prefrontal cortex capacity and maintain those warm, firm limits, you create the exact environmental stability the student needs to feel safe enough to actually show up to school.
Hence the 89% improved attendance.
Exactly. It transforms a self-reinforcing loop of stress into a self-reinforcing loop of wellness.
That is amazing. We've covered some incredibly dense, deeply important ground today, so let's just zoom out and summarize this journey for everyone listening. We started by redefining oppositional defiant disorder, moving past the casual, harmful labels of bad kids to understand the strict clinical reality, which is a deeply entrenched 6-month pattern of angry mood, defiant behavior, and vindictiveness that requires immense psychological energy to manage.
And from there, we mapped out the physiological reality of the classroom. We saw how the constant triggering of the amygdala places a profound emotional and physical burden on educators, making it biologically impossible for them to intervene effectively if they are unsupported.
Which brought us to the holistic solution currently operating in Georgia. By treating the classroom as an interconnected ecosystem, this framework combines evidence-based therapies like PCIT for the family and CBT for the student with confidential teletherapy for the educator. Throw in the logistical brilliance of same-day access and $0 Medicaid costs, and you have a system that doesn't just manage behavior. It actually heals the community.
It really does.
The core takeaway for you listening today is that mental health is never isolated. Child mental health and adult wellness are deeply, undeniably connected. You simply cannot treat the microphone while ignoring the speaker.
Beautifully said. Which leaves us with a final, somewhat provocative thought to mull over as we close.
Oh, I love these. Let's hear it.
We started this deep dive talking about how much we like to categorize things into separate buckets, like the child's problem over here, the adult's problem over there.
Right.
But if a child's clinical diagnosis, like ODD, fundamentally relies on the emotional regulation of the adults around them for successful treatment, how much of what we generally consider to be childhood behavioral problems is actually just a mirror, reflecting the unaddressed stress and burnout of the adults in their environment?